So, here I am on the train leaving Basel, going to Liestal, which is just outside of Basel. And I got Liszt on my mind, got Wagner on my mind. And as a loyal member of the Brotherhood of Pianists, I feel like I gotta right some wrongs and kind of defend Liszt here from this general historical snobbery that has affected Liszt the virtuoso. And here's my grand claim from the outset. If we look at Liszt from Wagner's, like, I'm gonna literally hit the reset button on culture and all of humanity, then nobody really meets that bar. If we look at Liszt more on a human level and more of just like a guy and a piano, then I think any sort of appreciation of his music takes on a different color. So here I am in Liestal, my beloved SBB train behind me. And the first thing we probably want to talk about with Liszt and this whole Wagner situation is just a brief biography of Liszt in three parts, because everything in the West is done in threes. Let's start with the late 1820s, 1830s. Liszt is a young pianist himself in like his late teens and 20s. He moves to Paris, the center of all musical activity, and just starts tearing it up. Nobody can play like Liszt. Funny story, the Paris Conservatory was getting too much attention like internationally, and so they put a cap on the amount of international students that they could have, and Liszt was not admitted to the Paris Conservatory. They changed that rule like a few years later. But at any rate, Liszt at that point is mostly known as a pianist, almost entirely known as a pianist. He's playing all these etudes that he's writing. He's writing a lot of transcriptions of things. He hears Paganini for the first time, which is a huge influence on Liszt as an instrumentalist, and spending a lot of time in Parisian salons. So meeting the rich, influential Europeans of the time. And so second period, we get to about like the 1840s, late 1840s. Liszt is trying to distance himself from this kind of like piano demon reputation. And he starts playing a lot more chamber music to try and like hide this virtuoso label that he gets stuck with. He then also takes up this job in Weimar, which is a huge change for him, because Weimar was where Goethe and Schiller and Hummel were based and living and doing a lot of their most important work. Goethe was in charge of the theater there and even the opera for the court in Weimar. And Goethe dies. This is a moment of national tragedy in Germany. And Liszt is eventually the one that gets chosen to take his place and replace him in his work. This causes huge outrage by some people, and some people are totally for it. This comes at a critical time for Liszt too, because Weimar is trying to kind of reinvent itself, but Liszt is also trying to reinvent himself. And he decides that the next step for music and the arts in general is going to be to combine literature and poetry and music into one art form. So he goes to Weimar and he decides, okay, this rejuvenation that needs to happen both in Weimar and for me is going to happen through this text and music. And already we can kind of feel the spirit of Wagner lurking in the background here once we start talking about combining arts and especially text and music. So in this period in Weimar, Liszt is writing, he starts writing his tone poems, where he takes a poem by somebody like Victor Hugo, one of the biggest poets of the time period, or just of European literature in general, And he says, okay, I'm going to capture the feeling of this poem and represent it in music. He wants to try to find some sort of analogous expression between poetry and music. So this becomes kind of a quintessential romantic art form and sets the precedent for a lot of future artists. You can think of something like Verklärte Nacht by Schönberg, or any of the Strauss, like Don Quixote, Ein Heldenleben. All of this comes directly from the precedent that Liszt set. So that is Weimar, and in Weimar he puts on Wagner operas. So here he's working more symphonically, so again kind of distancing himself from that. He's moving away from piano virtuoso land into composer, arranger, conductor land, and literary land. So the third period, he leaves Weimar after probably what you would have to say would be a success for all parties involved, despite the haters. And he decides to become an abbé. And in this period, naturally, there's a lot of religious music that gets written, like the 13 Stages of the Cross. And there's also, he starts writing just this absolutely just music that comes from who the hell knows where it comes from. Things like Nuage Gris, the Lugubrious Gondola, which is written for Wagner's funeral. It might even be a waltz, like La Valse sans tonalité, or something, like a waltz without tonality. And this music is absolutely revolutionary. I mean, nobody really picks up on it, which is the funny thing, but the language is so original and just atonal, and you could say anticipating some of the 20th century. So those are kinds of like the three periods. This virtuoso piano-oriented period where he's playing a lot of just absolutely disgustingly difficult, impressive piano stuff. And then he calms down a bit in the 1840s, and then eventually moves to Weimar, takes up this position where he replaces and carries on the spirit of Goethe and Schiller in Weimar, and then moving towards symphonic repertoire, and then finally towards the end of his life, he leaves Weimar, becomes an abbé, starts writing religious music and avant-garde solo piano pieces. So, here I am, getting off the train in Basel, platform 17. Never been to platform 17. Took this regional train in here. So it's going to be a long walk back to my bike. Liszt was great. Thanks for asking. And as we start talking about Wagner, the thing that we have to understand also about both of these guys is that it was never really going to work, because if there ever were two people who, like, this saloon ain't big enough for the both of us, it was both Liszt and Wagner were like exactly those two people. And in the 1830s and 40s, Liszt was fighting against Sigismund Thalberg, great virtuoso, darling boy of the aristocrats of the Théâtre des Italiens in Paris, and who was much more elegant, much more refined than Liszt. And the thing is that by the time he got to know Wagner, he was being compared to Wagner, obviously not as a pianist, but as a composer. And whether it's because Liszt was older, or because he just didn't have the same kind of like confidence in himself as a composer than as a pianist, there wasn't this feeling of like competition. But for Wagner, there was always going to be this feeling of competition, because Wagner had a lot to say about virtuosos. He said that the composer's best friend is the virtuoso, because everything depends on the person playing your music. I mean, you can be the composer of the best pieces, but in the end, it's only your piece when it's being played. At least that was, we can have a big metaphysical discussion about that later on. But this is the 19th century still. People aren't that metaphysical about music yet. So Wagner, like, the true art is still composition, and the person that is creating really from nothing, the music. But they need the virtuoso. So Wagner always has this kind of like love-hate relationship with with conductors and pianists and all this stuff, and Liszt is number one among those. In some of his earlier writing, Wagner criticizes Liszt, but then in some of his letters to Liszt, Wagner expresses that, hey man, you're the only one that I can trust with my music. For instance, I need you to conduct Lohengrin and Weimar for me, because you're the only one that I trust with this piece. So Liszt has huge respect for Wagner and this kind of Liszt, Wagner, and Berlioz form this kind of like cabal of like the bad boys of new music in the 19th century. And so Liszt agrees to perform a lot of his music and writes a lot of transcriptions for Wagner. Instead of writing virtuoso transcriptions on Bellini and Donizetti and Rossini and Mozart even, Liszt switches to writing less virtuosic, kind of literal transcriptions of Wagner operas. The most impressive one of which is Tannhäuser, and even though that one is absolutely a bear on the piano, it doesn't feel like a serious like virtuoso piece. It's more just an honest transcription of the orchestral setting. So again, we kind of feel Liszt kind of stepping back a little bit away from his taking the limelight as a pianist. All right, I just got back to my bike. It's still here. It's not the one that's on the ground. It's the shitty Cannondale that you see here. So I'm gonna get on that and continue this rumination later. So there's my bike. There's my bike. I'm at the Musikakademie der Stadt Basel now, and we're ready to talk about one of the biggest complicating factors in this whole situation, which is Wagner's wife, Cosima Wagner, who she makes things complicated basically everywhere she goes, as long as she's alive, into 1930 when she finally died. She first complicates things because the bloke that she was married to before Wagner was she also was the daughter of one Franz Liszt, a pianist who you might recognize from earlier in this video. So all of that results in a pretty complicated situation between Liszt and Wagner. Wagner is a composer who can't really play an instrument. Liszt is probably one of the best instrumentalists that ever lived, and certainly during his lifetime didn't have the reputation of being one of the best composers alive. So there's kind of that yin and yang situation going on. All this resulted in some periods where they got along super well. Wagner had countless financial troubles throughout his whole life, and Liszt came through and covered his ass more than once. So that's probably a bonus for the relationship, maybe not for like the overall health of it. But one of the more interesting differences for me is that Liszt was the ultimate kind of cosmopolitan. He didn't really have a mother language in quotation marks. He was often criticized for this in kind of a metaphorical sense, saying that he kind of didn't have a home. He was kind of this disembodied virtuoso who didn't really belong anywhere and couldn't really speak naturally. And from people who know what Wagner has to say about speaking naturally, especially as it pertains to things like anti-Semitism, and Wagner's whole view of what speaking and expressing yourself naturally means, that would definitely be a point against Liszt from Wagner's perspective. Wagner often tells Liszt that about Wagner's own like distinctly Teutonic perspective, and that Liszt is much more affected by Italy, France, Hungary, even some like German influences. And when they're pushing the boundaries of music, who stands to gain from this? For Wagner, Wagner's concept of universality is always going to be a distinctly kind of Teutonic universality. But for Liszt, it's much broader. And I think that you feel that in the language of the later compositions, both composers, you feel that in the language of the later compositions, and kind of interestingly, both composers went towards religion in their later periods, notably Wagner with Parsifal and Liszt with his, like the piece I mentioned earlier for small ensemble and choir. There's also a solo piano arrangement called the Via Crucis, the way he set music for the Stages of the Cross. And with both of those turns towards a spirituality, Wagner actually adopts a more conservative language, and Liszt adopts a much more free-form, experimental language, both harmonically speaking, structurally. He extensively quotes Bach, but then also has passages of just straight atonality. Whereas the language of Parsifal, it's not really a retrogression, but it's certainly a bit tamer than his earlier pieces. For me, that question has to do with their intended audience as artists. And I think Liszt kind of was always on this path of thinking about the art itself and kind of how to take the art to a next level. And I think that Wagner, in some ways, saw himself as the first and the last chapter of this new music that he was writing. And so that kind of makes sense why Parsifal would then be a sort of like cementing down of his language and his kind of expression. Whereas Liszt was, in every chapter of his life, was looking for the next thing. In his last pieces, you really feel that the flow of musical development, of genre development, is going to continue after Liszt. When you think about Parsifal, there really does feel like the last chapter. So I'm out here on my balcony now, overlooking the city of Basel. And the closing thoughts on Liszt and Wagner. They had a super close relationship musically and in terms of their family and unfortunately financially because of how much Liszt helped Wagner. But some of the notable differences, certainly aesthetically, were in the genres that they wrote in, but also politically. As a Lutheran liberalist, Wagner was his whole life totally against the Catholic Church, anti-capitalist, anti-aristocracy, whereas Liszt was, first of all, he became an abbey at the end of his life, and second of all, in the beginning of his life, he was completely dependent on the aristocracy of Europe, and that closeness kind of stayed with him his whole life. So both figures kind of knew what topics they needed to avoid when they were with each other to kind of get along. But it created this kind of symbiosis between two of the most revolutionary and important artists of the 19th century, and neither artist could have become what they eventually were without the other.